Welcome to week 3 of History 100. This is Carolyn Kuski, your instructor for this course. I'm going to give you a brief overview and a little information about the written assignments you're going to do in week 3, module 3. These are historical lenses. You're going to do a discussion post this week over historical lenses, so I'm going to explain a little bit about what they are. And you're going to do a written assignment that's a worksheet by selecting a secondary source from the research kit. So I'm going to go into a little bit more explanation about how to do that here in just a few minutes. But for right now, we're going to go on to the next slide. Let's get an overview of historical lenses as they are used in this course. First of all, each historian looks at history through their own scope of interest. This is not a bias. It's not dependent on their personal experience, although that may lead them in that direction. But they have a focus that they enjoy looking at history through more than others. So that's what this is going to discuss here on this slide. There's 3 main categories that have been identified in your course material through which historians view history. The first one is social. A social historian looks at the past by the experiences of the people who lived then. And it can be individuals, it can be a group of individuals, it can be society as a whole, but they focus on the everyday life, usually, of individuals, of the people. And this is very interesting. Most historians today are social historians because it's easy for us to relate to today. It can be very inspiring to find out that the struggles that people of the past went through and how similar they are to struggles that we have today. There's interesting lessons we can learn. People are endlessly fascinating. So that would be a lens of studying history that's called the social lens. Another lens is political. This is different from political science in college. Political science is in a different category, academic category of study than history, but a political historian kind of does similar things from a political scientist, although historians focus more on the past, the events of the past laws, past reasons for laws, past government structure, how the government developed over time. It can be foreign affairs, foreign relations, international relations. It could be relationships between politicians. So all of those things would be included in a political lens. Then the third lens is economic. This is looking at the economy of the United States. It can be a microcosm study of just one area of the economy or one place in the United States. You could look at agricultural economy, industrial economy, the general structure of the economy of the United States. You could talk about class structure in the United States, upper class, middle class, poor, working class. All of those things would have an economic viewpoint to them. And then there's a catch-all category called other, which is anything that doesn't fit into the first 3. Now, these categories can overlap somewhat in a narrative that a historian is telling, but what you want to look for is the dominant point of view. In other words, a social historian can include some political information and some economic information, but their basic focus is going to be on the people. You're going to learn a little bit more about this when you examine a secondary source in the from the research kit in the worksheet you're going to do. So I want to go over these 3 basic categories in a little bit more depth so you understand them. First of all, I'm using Dorothea Lange as an example of a social historian. She was a professional photographer during the Great Depression hired by the federal government to document the lifestyles of individuals during the Great Depression. As you can see, she liked to focus on the downtrodden, which there was millions of people in that situation. She also focused a lot on the Dust Bowl, on agricultural workers, and you can see by her photography here that I've chosen, You could use her photography to tell an economic story, to tell a historical narrative of politics at that time, but she focused on the social aspect. So this is an example of how the dominant viewpoint can include subcategories. Next, let's look at politicians or political lens. And I've chosen Franklin Roosevelt for this. He's the president during the 1930s, the Great Depression, and through the early 1940s during World War II. Roosevelt dies in April of 1945. World War II ended in August of 1945. You're going to be studying about the end of that war with the dropping of the atomic weapons on Japan by the United States. But these photographs of Roosevelt, obviously he's a political figure, so you would be looking at through a political lens if you wrote about him, but it doesn't mean you can't include things like his 5 children, the fact that he had polio, which you can't tell from this photograph on the back of a train there because he's wearing steel braces on his legs so he can stand. Most of the American public did not know they had a handicapped president during the economic crisis and the military crisis of World War II. Then you see him in an official capacity signing a document, and then in his wheelchair with his granddaughter and his little dog. So he's a politician. You're telling his story through a political lens, but it also can include aspects of other lenses as well. Next, for the economic lens to study history through, I've chosen the economic crisis of the late 1920s. So there's a couple of headlines there that refer to the crash of the stock market on October 29th, 1929, which incidentally was not the cause of the Great Depression. It was a symptom of the very bad economy that was getting worse and worse during the 1920s. Then there's a red line of middle-class, formerly employed people who can no longer feed themselves and are standing there asking for a handout. There's a political ad for President Hoover, who was very high on the prosperity of the United States when he was campaigning in 1928, which got him a lot of votes because people thought the economy could not ever get any worse. They thought it was going to continue to get better and better and better. Then the political cartoon from 1931 that shows Lady Justice sobbing over the failure of constitutional civil rights being applied by the Hoover administration. That's a political cartoon. So you see there's political aspects of this story about the economic collapse, but the basic viewpoint is from an economic lens. Okay, sources. I wanted to review the 2 dominant kinds of historical sources because this is very confusing to a lot of students. You've probably never heard these terms before, and I'm going to give you some examples, but just as a quick definition, a primary source is something that originated at the time, the historical time period that's being studied. A secondary source is something that is created after that time period, looking back on it with some reflection, with some analysis. They weren't personally involved, so it gives them a completely different focus. So these are examples of primary sources: the Constitution of the United States, the congressional bill that created the state of Alaska, a marriage certificate, a marriage photograph, a book of someone's personal experience in California during pioneer days, newspaper account of President Kennedy's assassination on the day he died, and a personal letter dated December 18th, 1921. All of those are primary documents. Secondary sources are something written later that just talk about the past event. So there's a Civil War dictionary of words that were popular to use during the Civil War that we may not use anymore, or may have different definitions today. So there's a dictionary of how you can understand primary sources from the Civil War, but it's a secondary source. All biographies are secondary sources because there's someone else writing about someone from the past. An autobiography is the person writing about themselves So autobiographies are always primary. History textbook. Unless it's a textbook written in the time period that's being studied, then history textbooks, all textbooks actually, are secondary because they are written in modern time looking at the past. They're created after the fact. Okay, your worksheet this week, 341, is gives you specific categories or instructions to follow to analyze a secondary source from the research kit. Remember, you cannot do any outside research for this course. You have to use the research kit for everything. Um, and the research kit makes it really easy because it's broken down into primary and secondary sources by category. So it eliminates you having to figure out what you find on the internet, if it's appropriate, if it's primary, if it's secondary. It's all provided for you already. So I hope you will read the instructions carefully, follow the rubric for each activity that you do this week. Please ask for help if you're confused or if you need explanation or if you have a comment, anything at all. I'm here to help you. I'm a teacher. Teaching online is difficult for me because I can't see you face to face. I can't just ramble on about about how to do things. So I really look forward to hearing from students and you allowing me to help you be successful in the course. And I look forward to that. Good luck with week 3.